Margaret Ellison had never been rich, but she had never let that define her. Her life was made up of careful decisions and quiet sacrifices, wrapped in humble clothes and long-forgotten dreams. At 67, she wore her age with grace, her gray-streaked hair always tied back, her cardigans always washed, if worn, and her manners untouched by time. She had raised her daughter Clara through days when pennies were counted like blessings and meals were composed of what was left at the end of the week. Clara had grown up watching her mother stretch every dollar, every favor, every ounce of strength, and yet, as adulthood wrapped Clara in modern ambitions and designer aspirations, all that Margaret had done seemed to evaporate from her memory like chalk from a rain-washed sidewalk. It was Clara's 40th birthday, a grand affair. In her sprawling suburban house, with its white pillars and chandelier-lit foyer, Margaret had received a formal invitation in the mail. No phone call, no loving reminder, just a stiff card with her name printed beneath a glossy image of champagne glasses. She arrived at Clara's door in a modest beige coat and scuffed loafers. She had even brought a handmade gift, a photo album of Clara's childhood memories, meticulously preserved in plastic sleeves, each caption handwritten in her soft cursive. It wasn't a gift from wealth, but it was from love. Clara opened the door wearing heels so high they made her mother's back ache just to look at them. Her silk dress shimmered with a price tag Margaret didn't dare imagine. For a moment, Clara stared at her mother like she hadn't expected her to come at all. Her smile was forced, and her hug was hollow. Margaret noticed, but said nothing. Inside, laughter echoed off the marble floors. Clara's friends were gathered in stylish groups, wine in one hand, phone in the other. They wore makeup like armor and greeted Margaret with lukewarm nods. She moved through the room like an old photograph and ignored. No one asked her how she was doing, or how she had gotten there, or how life had treated her since Clara moved out. She sat at the edge of the living room, alone on a corner couch that smelled like potpourri and wealth. Clara finally walked over, her face flushed with wine and vanity. "Mom, you could have worn something nicer," she said under her breath, glancing at Margaret's cardigan. Margaret simply smiled. "This is your father's favorite. He bought it for our 25th anniversary. Clara's face didn't soften. "That was 30 years ago, Mom." They sat in silence for a moment before a server brought around a tray of chilled cocktails. Margaret politely declined. She noticed that no one else did. When the cake arrived, 3 tiers, frosted in gold and studded with edible flowers. Clara's friends gathered around for photos, phones flashing like strobe lights in a nightclub. Margaret watched from a distance. She remembered the birthday cakes she used to bake for Clara, sometimes with only a few eggs and half a cup of sugar to spare. She remembered cutting strawberries into heart shapes and arranging them with trembling hands. She remembered the way Clara used to clap and say, "You're the best mommy in the world." Now, that little girl had vanished. After the celebration quieted down, Margaret found Clara near the kitchen. She offered her the album with both hands, like a sacred object. "I made this for you," she said. Clara took it, flipped through a few pages without reading, and set it aside on the counter like junk mail. "Thanks. That's single quotes sweet." The dismissal wasn't harsh, but it cut deeper than cruelty. Margaret felt her throat tighten. She turned to leave, but Clara, half distracted by a buzzing phone, said, "You know, Mom, maybe it's time you let go of all this sentimental stuff. You always lived in the past. That's why you're still where you are." Margaret paused. "Where I am?" Clara sipped her wine. "I mean, you've never really done anything. You're just ... always poor, always scraping by. Don't you ever wish you were more than that?" The words weren't said with anger. They were said with something worse, casual pity. Like her, life was something to be pitied, not respected. Margaret looked at her daughter, really looked. She saw the way Clara stood with her chin slightly raised, like being near poverty was a risk of contamination. She saw the woman who had forgotten the nights Margaret had gone to bed hungry so Clara could eat. The winter mornings she walked Clara to school in the snow because the bus money had gone toward medicine. "You think I never did anything?" Margaret asked quietly. Clara shrugged, scrolling through her phone. "It's not personal. You just never really had ambition. That's all. Some people are born to work hard. Others are born to build something." Margaret's silence was a still lake, deep and vast. "Anyway, Clara continued. I'm just saying, maybe if you had aimed a little higher, you wouldn't be living in that tiny place with peeling paint. You always said you were happy, but were you really? Or did you just settle because you couldn't afford anything else? Asterisk for a moment. Margaret thought of defending herself. She thought of explaining the nights she spent sewing clothes for neighbors, baking goods to sell at the market, volunteering at the local library, just to feel needed. She thought of telling Clara about the time she turned down a proposal because the man wanted to move her away from her sick mother. She thought of recounting her quiet sacrifices, but what would it matter? Asterisk, she took a breath and said, I'm proud of my life. Clara didn't look up. Margaret turned and walked toward the door. The party music had faded, replaced by soft jazz and low murmurs. No one noticed the old woman leaving. Outside, the air was cold, and the night was quiet. Margaret clutched her coat tighter around her and walked to the bus stop. Asterisk, she didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, God, it did, but because she had learned long ago that tears didn't solve things. They only blurred your vision when you needed it clear. Asterisk, as the bus pulled up and the doors hissed open, Margaret stepped in, holding the pole as she found her seat. She sat quietly, the city lights blurring past the window like forgotten dreams. Asterisk, her daughter thought she had nothing. Asterisk, her daughter thought she was invisible, irrelevant, useless. Maybe the world did too, but deep within Margaret, something flickered, a quiet strength, a whisper that had waited too long to be heard. She looked down at her wrinkled hands, the same hands that had built a life out of thin air, and smiled faintly. Asterisk, Clara may have mocked her today, but she had no idea what her mother was truly made of. The time for silence was over. Asterisk and the world was about to find out who Margaret Ellison really was. Asterisk, would you like me to continue with chapter 2 next, in a similar style? The next morning, the quiet hum of Margaret's old apartment greeted her like a familiar melody. Her fingers moved in practiced rhythm, boiling water for tea, feeding the cat, opening the drapes just wide enough to let the gray morning light in, but not so wide as to expose her solitude. The apartment was small, modestly decorated with lace curtains and sepia-toned photographs, the kind of place that whispered of a life lived frugally but purposefully. She had never owned much, but everything in her space had a story. It was her gallery of silent resilience. Asterisk still stung from Clara's words the night before. Margaret sat with her tea, hands wrapped around the warm mug like a lifeline. The insult had nested in her mind, replaying in cruel loops. You never really did anything. What an odd way to measure a life. What did doing something even mean in a world where kindness, sacrifice, and integrity didn't earn a line in anyone's resume? Asterisk, she stared at the bookshelf across the room, an old pinewood frame, sagging under the weight of a lifetime's worth of books, journals, and boxers. Each shelf held a piece of who she used to be, literature, recipes, letters, and most significantly, her husband Walter's notebooks. Asterisk, Walter had passed away 17 years ago, taken too soon by a heart attack that no insurance could have anticipated or softened. He had been a thoughtful man, quiet but sharp, a tinkerer, a dreamer, someone who sketched out ideas for things he never had the capital to build. She missed him, often in silence, and especially when their daughter made her feel small. Walter would have never allowed that. Asterisk, driven by an instinct she couldn't explain, Margaret rose and pulled an old cardboard box from the lowest shelf. Dust puffed into the air as she opened it, revealing stacks of paper carefully tied with twine. Some were receipts and tax returns, others letters and birthday cards, but beneath them was a thick, leather-bound ledger. Walter's journal, dated from the early 1990s. Margaret hadn't opened it in years. Asterisk, as she flipped through the pages, his handwriting came alive. Schematics, cost projections, strange acronyms she had long since forgotten. One entry caught her attention. July 17, 1994, invested $5,000 in small startup, promising tech, holding certificate in lockbox. She paused. Vital Stream. Asterisk, the name rang the faintest bell. Her fingers trembled slightly as she set the journal aside and reached for a metal box in her bedroom closet, a lockbox Walter had always insisted on keeping, but one Margaret rarely opened. Inside were documents, birth certificates, insurance files, an old silver watch, and a yellowed envelope labeled Vital Stream Shareholder Certificate. Asterisk, she pulled it out, heart suddenly thudding in her chest. The paper was thin but official, stamped and signed, 500 shares of Vital Stream Technologies Inc. It was dated the same year Walter wrote about it, She stared at the certificate, trying to make sense of its significance. Could these shares be worth anything now? Asterisk, her first thought was skepticism. Most startups from the 90s had fizzled out or been absorbed by tech giants and buried. But something tugged at her the way Walter had carefully preserved this paper. The fact that he mentioned it with cautious optimism. Perhaps it wasn't worthless after all. Asterisk, Margaret had never used a smartphone, but she did own an old laptop gifted to her by a neighbor's son. She dusted it off, plugged it in, and after a few huffs and slow clicks, she was online, typing VitalStream Technologies Inc. stock history. Into the search bar led her down a rabbit hole of news articles and financial websites. Asterisk, to her astonishment, VitalStream had not only survived, had thrived. Rebranded as ViaStream Global in 2010, it had been acquired by a tech conglomerate in 2017. The company had since gone public under the new name, with shares splitting twice in the last decade. According to an article from just last year, original investors who held on to their shares were now sitting on fortunes. Asterisk, Margaret stared at the screen. Asterisk 500. Original shares. Asterisk post-split, and with current valuations, that translated into 10,000 shares. Asterisk, she blinked. The current share price was listed as $92.34. Her heart skipped. She opened the calculator app, punched in the numbers. Asterisk, $92.34 times 10,000 shares. Her breath caught. $923,400. Asterisk, she leaned back in her chair, stunned. Nearly $1 million. Just sitting there, forgotten, untouched, hidden in a lockbox beneath birthday cards and love letters. Her husband's foresight had preserved their future, and she had been blind to it for nearly 3 decades. Asterisk 4. A long while, Margaret didn't move. The news hit her in slow waves. Disbelief, then joy, then an overwhelming sense of grief that Walter wasn't there to see this moment. He had always believed in the quiet power of patience and preparation, and now, his belief had gifted her a second chance. Asterisk, the next step, she knew, required help. Margaret wasn't savvy with finance or legal procedures. She needed someone who could guide her through cashing in the shares, handling taxes, setting up trusts. But more importantly, she needed someone she could trust. Not Clara, definitely not her. Asterisk, she remembered a kind young man named Daniel from the community center, a volunteer tax advisor who had helped her with filing last year's return. Soft-spoken, professional, and above all, patient with her questions. She found his card in her kitchen drawer and dialed the number. Asterisk, Daniel Fletcher speaking. Asterisk, hello, Daniel, this is Margaret Ellison. You may not remember me, but asterisk, I remember you, Miss Ellison, he said warmly. You brought banana bread during tax season, best I ever had. What can I do for you? Asterisk, she laughed softly. I found something unusual. I might need some help evaluating it. Asterisk, she didn't go into detail over the phone, but they set an appointment for the following afternoon. As she hung up, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not about the money, not yet, but about the doors this discovery could open, the quiet revenge it could offer, not just against Clara, but against the world that had dismissed her simply because she had grown old and poor. Asterisk, she spent the evening combing through more of Walter's notes. Each page felt like a conversation, each scribble a whisper from the man who had never stopped believing in her. And now, with this revelation, Margaret was beginning to believe in herself again, too, not as a victim, not as a relic, but as a woman with options. Asterisk later, curled in bed with the soft hum of the heater in the background, Margaret stared at the ceiling. She imagined walking into Clara's house not as the poor, pitiful mother to be tolerated, but as someone untouchable, as someone powerful. She wouldn't throw her money in anyone's face. That wasn't her style. But she would make it known. She would rewrite her legacy, not with petty revenge, but with dignity, elegance, and grace, qualities Clara had mistaken for weakness. Asterisk, and when the world, especially her daughter, saw her name in places they never expected, on plaques, in charity gala brochures, maybe even in a magazine, then they would understand. Asterisk, they would remember Margaret Ellison. Asterisk, the woman who had never really done anything, except of course, change everything quietly. Would you like me to begin? Chapter 3 now. Daniel Fletcher greeted Margaret with the kind of smile that made her feel at ease. He wasn't dressed in a stiff suit like the people at Clara's party, but in a neat sweater over a button-down shirt, clean and composed. His office was small, but inviting, potted plants in the corners, warm lighting, and framed quotes on the wall about honesty and legacy. He offered her tea, which she accepted, and they sat across from each other at a mahogany desk that bore more books than gadgets. Margaret pulled out the envelope with the Vital Stream certificate and placed it gently on the desk. I need to know if this is worth anything, or if it's just an old piece of paper from a time when we still believed in miracles. Daniel opened the envelope carefully, his brows lifting slightly as he read the certificate. He tilted his glasses and turned to his computer, typing quickly. For a few minutes, there was only the sound of soft clicking and Margaret's faint heartbeat thrumming in her ears. You weren't wrong, he finally said, eyes wide. Vital Stream rebranded as V-Stream Global. They were acquired, and the shares went through 2 major splits. Assuming you never sold any, these original 500 shares would now be, wow, 10,000. Margaret nodded slowly, already familiar with the math but still startled to hear it confirmed by someone else. At the current price, Daniel continued, spinning the screen toward her. They're trading at just over $92 a share. I calculated it, she whispered. Over 900,000. Daniel smiled, impressed. Exactly. The certificate predates the digital tracking system, but your ownership can still be validated and converted into a modern brokerage account. You'll need to go through a transfer agent. Do you have identification, proof of Walter's passing, and a will? I have it all, Margaret said. She had prepared for this moment with the same careful diligence that had helped her survive all these years. She might not have lived with abundance, but she had always lived with order. Good, Daniel said. I can walk you through the entire process: registration, valuation, taxes, everything. But I'd also suggest speaking with a financial planner and an estate lawyer. With this kind of money, you'll want protection against people and against mistakes. Margaret nodded again. She could already hear Clara's voice in her head if she ever found out. Why didn't you tell me sooner? But she had no intention of telling her. Not yet. What do you plan to do with it? Daniel asked gently. Margaret looked down at her hands, the same hands Clara had once said were old and tired. She flexed her fingers slowly. I'm not sure yet, but I do know I want to use it well. I want to create something that means something. Daniel's eyes softened. That's a beautiful place to begin. For the next hour, they reviewed documents, signed a few papers, and arranged appointments. By the end of it, Margaret had a clear path forward. Her shares would be converted, verified, and placed into a temporary trust account until she decided what to do long term. Daniel promised discretion and offered his full support. She left his office with a folder full of papers and a heart full of plans. The air outside felt different, as if the city itself had shifted slightly, leaning toward her for the first time in decades. She didn't go straight home. Instead, she walked. Her steps weren't hurried, they were deliberate, grounded. For years, she had moved like a ghost in the world and noticed, bypassed, dismissed. She was the old woman people passed on sidewalks without a glance, but now, for the first time in a long while, she felt seen, even if it was just by herself. At a cafe downtown, she ordered a cappuccino and sat by the window. The warmth of the cup in her hands brought back a memory Clara as a little girl, sitting on her lap, pretending to sip tea like a grown-up. One day I'll have a big house, and you'll live with me forever, Clara had said. How far they'd come from that day. Margaret sipped slowly, watching people rush past the window. She didn't envy them anymore. Her life had moved at a slower pace, but it had depth. She had loved deeply. She had sacrificed quietly. She had survived honestly. And now she was ready to thrive. Later that evening, back at home, she called her lawyer, a kind woman named Judith who had helped settle Walter's affairs years ago. Judith, though surprised to hear from her after so long, quickly agreed to meet. They met the next day in Judith's office, where Margaret explained the situation with remarkable composure. Judith listened, asked sharp questions, and soon had a plan sketched out. They would establish a trust in Margaret's name, designate specific funds for future use, and create a plan for charitable giving under a foundation bearing Walter's initials. I don't want Clara to know, Margaret added. Judith paused. You don't trust her. She doesn't respect me, Margaret replied. and she only values what shines. This fortune isn't for her to squander. Not yet. Asterisk. Judith nodded. It's your right. Asterisk. Over the next 2 weeks, everything moved quickly. The certificate was validated, the shares confirmed, the money transferred. Margaret's name appeared on a list of top local investors in a quiet publication no one in her social circle read except for one columnist who noticed her sudden appearance. That's when the unexpected happened. A journalist from Forbes' local impact reached out. They were doing a feature on unexpected philanthropists, elderly individuals who had built community projects under the radar. Daniel had discreetly submitted Margaret's story, with her permission, and the magazine was intrigued. They offered to include her in a small profile piece, nothing flashy, just a photo and a paragraph. Asterisk. At first, Margaret resisted, but then she remembered Clara's voice, cold, dismissive, belittling. She didn't want revenge, but visibility, that was different. Asterisk. The interview was conducted over tea at Margaret's apartment. The photographer, respectful and kind, captured her in soft light near the window. The headline the next week read, Asterisk. The forgotten grandmother who owns a city block, Margaret Ellison, and the quiet power of patience. Asterisk. The article spread faster than expected. People in the neighborhood recognized her from the cover. Shopkeepers greeted her differently. Strangers started asking for advice, or simply saying hello with warmth. And somewhere out there, Margaret knew Clara would see it too. She didn't have to shove it in her daughter's face. She just had to wait. Asterisk. Back at home, she sat at her kitchen table with the magazine in hand. Her fingers traced the glossy photo, her own eyes staring back at her. She thought of Walter, what he would say if he could see this. Likely nothing. He'd just squeeze her hand and smile. Asterisk. As the evening light turned golden through the curtains, Margaret felt something she hadn't in years, a rising sense of purpose. The money was only the beginning. She had the resources now to build what she always dreamed of, a literacy program for single mothers, a small shelter for the elderly, a scholarship fund in Walter's name. She had ideas, real ones, and people who finally listened. Asterisk. She would never be the loudest voice in the room, but she didn't need to be. Her legacy was already unfolding, not in extravagant gestures, but in every soul she would lift, every stranger she'd inspire. Asterisk. She folded the magazine, lit a small candle for Walter, and whispered, "We did it, love." The fire flickered in quiet approval. "Would you like me to write chapter 4 next in the same style?" Margaret woke up earlier than usual, long before the sun crept over the buildings outside her small apartment. The city was still asleep, wrapped in that rare hour of silence where everything felt possible. She stood by the window, looking down at the nearly empty street, her breath fogging the glass. The magazine with her face on the cover lay neatly on the table behind her, folded and untouched since the day it arrived. It wasn't vanity that made her keep it, it was proof. Proof of who she really was, and who she'd always been beneath the worn sweaters and quiet smiles. Asterisk. The money hadn't changed her routines. She still made her own breakfast, still walked to the park to feed the birds, still greeted her neighbors with a nod and a soft good morning. But the way people looked at her had shifted. Even the grocer across the street, who used to offer expired items with a forced smile, now insisted she take the freshest produce on the house, no less. Margaret declined each time, but she noticed the difference. But she hadn't told Clara. Not yet. Her daughter still believed her to be small, insignificant, and poor. Clara had stopped calling entirely since the birthday incident, and Margaret hadn't reached out, not out of pride, but out of clarity. She now understood something she had always tried to ignore. Clara didn't see her mother. She only saw a mirror, reflecting her own ego. And when that mirror wasn't flattering enough, she looked away. Asterisk. It had taken Margaret years to unlearn the habit of apologizing for her existence. Now, with control over nearly $1 million and a growing reputation as a quiet philanthropist, she didn't feel the need to explain herself anymore. She was no longer begging for respect. She was earning it on her own terms. That day, Margaret had a meeting scheduled at a notary office across town. The trust and foundation set up under her and Walter's name were nearly complete. She had also decided to purchase 3 buildings, 2 for rental income and 1 to convert into a community center. It would be called the Ellison Place. The idea had come to her while watching a boy help his grandmother across the street, and she thought, what if there was a place for people like them? A warm, free space with books, music, tea, and no judgment. Asterisk, the cab driver who picked her up glanced at her through the mirror. You, that lady from the magazine, right? The one with the smile? Asterisk, Margaret smiled again. I suppose I am. Asterisk, he nodded, grinning. My wife loved your story. Said it gave her hope. Asterisk, hope. That word had always meant more to Margaret than love or success. Hope had been her companion through long winters and lonely evenings, and now she was giving it back. Asterisk, the notary visit was brief. Margaret signed documents with a steady hand. Ownership of the buildings was finalized, and the charitable status of the foundation was officially recognized. She was no longer just a grandmother living alone in a small apartment. She was a founder, a benefactor, a woman with power to make change. Asterisk, but even as she stepped out of the notary's office into the crisp afternoon air, she didn't feel like someone who had arrived. She felt like someone who had begun. Asterisk, later that evening, she sat at the kitchen table sorting through handwritten ideas. She was building a list of things she wanted to do. Not buy, not flaunt, but do. Establishing a scholarship for young women from disadvantaged backgrounds was at the top. A close second was organizing weekend dinners at local shelters, meals served by volunteers with dignity and warmth, as if they were hosting royalty. She was mid-thought when the phone rang. She hesitated. Asterisk, almost no one called her landline anymore, except telemarketers and the library, but when she picked it up and heard the voice on the other end, her heart sank. Hi, Mom, Clara said. It had been weeks. Maybe even months. The voice sounded lighter, almost casual, but there was a tightness beneath the surface. Margaret knew that tone. It was the sound of someone rehearsing kindness they didn't quite feel. Asterisk, hello, Clara, Margaret replied evenly. Asterisk, I was thinking of dropping by, Clara said. Just wanted to see how you were doing. Asterisk, Margaret paused. Is everything all right? Asterisk, Clara hesitated. Yeah, I've been thinking about you. I know I wasn't very kind the last time we saw each other. Asterisk, no apology, just a vague acknowledgement. Margaret wasn't surprised. Asterisk, well, Margaret said gently, you're welcome to come by. I'm home most evenings. Asterisk, tomorrow, then, around 4. Asterisk, Margaret agreed, though her instincts warned her. She didn't need to guess the reason. The article had likely reached Clara through one of her friends, or maybe even by accident in a waiting room, and now, curiosity, something more desperate, was dragging her back. Asterisk, the next day, Margaret dressed in a simple cream sweater and slacks. She wore no jewelry except for her wedding ring, still bright despite the years. She placed 2 cups on the kitchen counter and made tea. At 4 sharp, the doorbell rang. Asterisk, Clara stood at the threshold in a fitted blazer, designer shoes, and a forced smile. Asterisk, you look nice, she said. Asterisk, Margaret smiled faintly. So do you. Asterisk, they sat. Margaret poured the tea. Asterisk, for a few minutes, they exchanged pleasantries, how the weather had turned, how Clara's neighborhood was undergoing renovations, how traffic was worse than ever. Then Clara shifted. I saw the article, she said. Margaret didn't flinch. I assumed you might. Asterisk, Clara's expression was unreadable. Why didn't you tell me? Asterisk, would it have mattered? Margaret asked, not unkindly. Asterisk, Clara's eyes narrowed, slightly offended. Of course it would have mattered. I'm your daughter. Asterisk, Margaret held her gaze. And yet, you called me a failure. You mocked my life. You judged me for not wearing designer clothes or living in a fancy home. You dismissed me. Why would I offer you the truth when you never valued it? Asterisk, Clara looked away. I was just frustrated. I didn't mean it. Asterisk, Margaret nodded. I know, but you did mean some of it. And that's the part I can't ignore. The room was quiet for a long moment. Clara sighed. Things haven't been easy lately. My business isn't doing well. I'm drowning in bills. I thought maybe you could help. There it was. Not affection. Not reconciliation. Need. Margaret didn't scold her. She didn't cry or lecture. She simply said, I'm willing to help, but not with money. Asterisk, Clara blinked. What does that mean? Asterisk, I've recently acquired 3 buildings, Margaret said. One will become a community center. I need someone to run the logistics, scheduling, outreach, volunteers. It pays modestly, but it's meaningful work. If you'd like the job, it's yours. Asterisk, Clara's jaw tightened. You want me to run a charity center? Asterisk, I want you to earn your way back into trust, Margaret said gently. I want you to understand value in a way that money never will. Asterisk. Clara stood up, visibly insulted. So this is your revenge? Asterisk. No, Margaret said. This is my legacy. And you're welcome to be part of it if you're ready to grow. Asterisk. Clara didn't respond. She picked up her purse and walked to the door. Just before she stepped out, she turned. You know, you were always so good at guilt. Margaret didn't reply. After Clara left, Margaret stood by the window, again, watching the fading sky. She didn't feel regret. She felt peace. She had not turned her daughter away. She had extended a hand, not a check, and maybe, someday, Clara would take it, or maybe she wouldn't. Asterisk. Either way, Margaret had done what she believed was right. Asterisk. She was no longer the woman who lived in shadows, waiting for love that came conditionally. She was the light now, and she had no intention of dimming again. Asterisk. Would you like chapter 5 next? Margaret wasn't surprised when Clara didn't call again. Asterisk. Not the next day, not the next week, not even after a full month had passed since their tense conversation over tea. She had hoped, quietly and sincerely, that offering her daughter a dignified path forward, one of purpose instead of pity, might ignite something deeper in her. But the silence that followed spoke louder than any argument could have. Clara hadn't wanted reconciliation. She had wanted rescue. Asterisk. It was a strange thing, watching your child drift into the fog of disappointment, not because they failed, but because they chose not to rise. Margaret had given her a lifeline. She'd given her a chance to earn back trust and perhaps even rediscover herself along the way. But Clara had been too offended to see the gift in the offer. Asterisk. The city moved on. The days warmed, the trees bloomed, and with every passing week, Margaret's life became richer, not just financially, but emotionally. The Ellison Foundation had begun taking shape. Daniel helped her find honest staff to manage its paperwork. Judith, her lawyer, connected her to nonprofit consultants who specialized in housing and education. Her small team grew, passionate, grounded people who shared her vision for doing quiet good in loud times. Asterisk. The community center Ellison Place was halfway through renovations. The moment the building was legally hers, Margaret had walked through its empty halls and closed her eyes. She could hear it already, the sound of laughter, of turning pages, of boiling kettles and clinking cups. It wouldn't just be a shelter, or a clinic, or a library. It would be a haven, a human place, a space of kindness. Asterisk. And for once, she didn't feel like she was dreaming too big. Then, one ordinary afternoon, she received an unexpected visitor. Was sitting by the window knitting a scarf to donate to a local shelter when the knock came, a sharp, hurried tap she recognized instantly. Not the light, polite knock of a stranger. The impatient knock of someone who wanted something. Asterisk. When she opened the door, she found Clara standing there. But something had changed. Asterisk. She looked tired. Her makeup was subtle, her hair hastily pulled back, gone with the expensive heels and designer jacket. She wore flats and a blazer that had seen better days. Her purse strap was frayed. Asterisk. Hi, Clara said, her voice dry. Can I come in? Asterisk. Margaret stepped aside. She didn't smile, but she didn't shut the door either. Asterisk. Clara sat at the kitchen table, staring at the faded floral tablecloths she had once mocked. For a long while, she didn't speak. Margaret poured 2 cups of tea and sat across from her. Asterisk. Clara finally sighed. I need help. Margaret sipped her tea, waiting. My business collapsed. The bank closed our credit line. I had to sell the car. I laid off my assistant. I'm weeks behind on rent. Asterisk. Margaret's eyes softened, but her posture didn't change. Asterisk. Clara continued. I didn't come here for a lecture. I didn't come for judgment. I don't know where else to go. Asterisk. Margaret placed her cup down and spoke calmly. You do know I offered you work. Asterisk. Clara nodded, embarrassed. I thought I was above it. Asterisk. And now? Margaret asked gently. Asterisk. I don't know. Clara admitted. I feel like a failure. Asterisk. Margaret's voice didn't rise. Not because you lost money, because you refused to learn, because you thought survival was beneath you. Asterisk. Clara looked down. Maybe. Asterisk. They sat in silence again, the air between them heavy but not hostile. Asterisk. Margaret stood and retrieved a folder from the kitchen drawer. Inside were documents outlining a program her foundation had just approved, a financial literacy initiative for women in crisis. It included mentorship, job training, emotional support, and flexible work within the foundation's branches. Asterisk. She handed it to Clara. We're launching this in 3 weeks. I need someone with experience in operations to help organize the pilot program. It pays modestly, but it's steady and respected. Clara took the folder hesitantly. Are you offering me this job? I'm offering it to the person who's willing to work, Margaret replied, not to the one who thinks she deserves shortcuts. Clara read through the pages, her eyes scanning terms and requirements. She wasn't crying, but her shoulders were trembling slightly. I'll do it, she whispered. If you'll still have me. Margaret reached over and placed her hand on Clara's. It was the first time in years she had initiated contact. You're still my daughter, but I won't save you from consequences. I can only walk beside you if you're willing to walk, too. Clara nodded, silently. And so it began, not a reconciliation wrapped in apology and hugs, but a reconstruction of something that had been broken for years. Clara started working 2 weeks later under a supervisor who had no idea she was the founder's daughter. Margaret insisted on that. If Clara wanted to earn her place, she would do it with dignity and discipline. At first, Clara struggled. The tasks were unglamorous paperwork, scheduling, even answering phones. But to her credit, she didn't complain. Slowly, she found herself warming to the work. She sat in on meetings with women who had fled abusive marriages, women who had raised children on their own while juggling night shifts. She met survivors of trauma who still showed up every day with strength in their eyes. For the first time, Clara felt humbled not by loss, but by witness. She wasn't the center of this world, and that, strangely, brought her peace. One evening, after a long day of fieldwork at one of the new outreach locations, Clara walked into the main office where Margaret was reviewing grant proposals. She waited until the others left and then sat down. I met a woman today, Clara said softly. She lost everything in a fire-hurt house, her job, even her dog, and she still smiled at me like the sun had never stopped shining. I asked her how she does it. Margaret looked up. And what did she say? She said, it's easier to lose things when you know who you are. Margaret let that sink in. Clara continued, I never knew who I was. I always tried to be someone impressive. But now, for the first time, I think I'm becoming someone decent. Margaret reached out again, holding Clara's hand just like she had when she was a little girl afraid of storms. I see that, and I'm proud of you. Clara looked down at their intertwined fingers. I was cruel to you, Mom. Not just once. For years, I saw your sacrifice as weakness. I treated your wisdom like noise. Margaret didn't interrupt. Clara's voice cracked. But you were always strong. Stronger than I ever gave you credit for. Margaret finally spoke, her voice low but resolute. I didn't need your praise. I needed your respect. And now, perhaps, we're finally finding it. They sat there, long into the evening, no longer as mother and child, estranged by status and pride, but as women flawed, trying, learning. Outside, the city lights blinked gently. The world went on, indifferent to their transformation. But inside that modest office something rare had happened. Not a miracle, not a sudden burst of forgiveness, but a slow, patient thawing of years of bitterness. Margaret knew that trust would take time. That love, once bruised, didn't return easily. But for now, the silence was over. The bridge was being rebuilt stone by stone, conversation by conversation, that she had not planned for this chapter of her life to be about healing. But maybe that was the greatest wealth of all. Would you like chapter 6 next in the same format and tone? Margaret sat at the corner desk in the community center's new main office, a modest space painted in warm tones and softened by donated potted plants and a scattering of used books. The buzz of conversation floated in from the main hall volunteers, coordinating schedules, a few mothers laughing while their children played nearby. The soft clink of cups from the tea stand they'd recently added, it felt alive, full, like something worth waking up early for. She glanced up from the grant forms she'd been reviewing and looked through the open doorway, just in time to see Clara helping an elderly woman with a clipboard. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't faking politeness. She was listening. It had been 3 months since Clara joined the foundation. In that time, she had gone from wary employee to engaged coordinator. She didn't ask for shortcuts. She stayed late. She sat in rooms that once made her uncomfortable. People who spoke of hardship without shame, around co-workers who didn't care about her last name or what car she used to drive. At first, Margaret watched her daughter with caution. She expected the performance to end, eventually, for the old entitlement to re-emerge, but it didn't. Clara seemed genuinely changed, not entirely, not in every moment, but in the ways that mattered. She started bringing lunch for the interns. She started walking instead of taking cabs. She even stopped wearing makeup to work. But more than that, she began asking Margaret questions. Not the kind that begged for validation, the kind that carried weight. How did you keep going when you were tired? What made you believe in people, even when they disappointed you? Why didn't you tell me how hard it really was? The questions had no simple answers. Sometimes Margaret answered with a story. Sometimes she only smiled. But always, she answered. And slowly, a new relationship formed between them, not a perfect one, but a real one. That morning, after a particularly successful fundraising meeting, Margaret found Clara waiting for her in the quiet break room, holding 2 mugs of tea, one with a dash of honey, just the way Margaret liked it. I wanted to ask you something, Clara said as she handed over the cup. Margaret raised an eyebrow. That sounds serious. Clara smiled nervously. It is, kind of. She sat, looking unsure for a moment, then leaned forward. I've been thinking about applying for the director role. Margaret blinked. Director? For the community center, Clara said. Not the foundation, obviously. Just the center. The board is planning to post the position next month. And I know I'm not the most obvious choice, but I've been learning everything I can, from the ground up. Margaret didn't reply immediately. She took a long sip of her tea, watching her daughter closely. Clara rushed in to fill the silence. I know I've made mistakes. I know I've hurt you, and maybe this is too soon, or too much. But I want to lead something that means something. I want to help people the way you've helped me, not just as your daughter, as myself. There was vulnerability in her voice, not the polished, performative kind, the trembling, aching kind that Margaret hadn't heard since Clara was a child, afraid of thunderstorms. You don't need my permission, Margaret said gently. If you believe in what you're doing, apply. Clara hesitated. But I do want your blessing. Margaret smiled, then softly, without drama, but with a warmth that only comes after long winters. You have it. Clara's eyes shimmered, but she nodded, swallowing her emotion the way proud people do when they're still learning how to be open. The next few weeks passed quickly. Clara submitted her application, interviewed with the board, and continued her work with the same diligence. She didn't assume she would win. In fact, Margaret was sure that she expected to lose. And perhaps that humility was part of what made the board vote unanimously in her favor. When the decision came, the announcement was made quietly during a staff lunch. Clara had been mid-sentence, talking about a new program for single parents, when the board chair stood up and simply said, "We're pleased to announce that Clara Ellison has been appointed director of the Ellison Place Community Center." There was applause, real, genuine applause. And for a moment, Clara looked stunned. She didn't rush up to the podium or make a grand speech. She stood, nodded humbly, and said, "I'll do my best, every single day." That night, Margaret sat alone in her apartment with a glass of water and the city lights pouring in through the windows. She had never imagined this strange and healing journey. She had spent so many years feeling like her story had ended in obscurity. But now, she realized it had only just begun, and not only for her. A week later, the official opening of the center was scheduled. They planned a modest event, open house tours, a community potluck, short speeches, and a dedication wall. Margaret had resisted the idea of a plaque in her honor, but the board insisted, and, to her surprise, Clara did too. On the day of the opening, Margaret arrived early. She wore a lavender blouse, her late husband's brooch pinned to her collar, and comfortable shoes. She didn't care to impress anyone. She had nothing left to prove. The center was spotless. Every wall bore artwork from local children. The shelves were full of donated books. The kitchen humming with volunteers preparing meals. The smell of fresh paint and coffee lingered in the air. It wasn't a glamorous place, but it was sacred. Outside, guests started arriving. Donors, neighbors, former skeptics, new believers. A local reporter came to do a follow-up on Margaret's story, but she politely declined an interview. "Let the work speak," she said with a smile. Asterisk when it was time for speeches, Margaret was seated in the front row. The mayor gave an opening note, the board chair spoke next, and then Clara stepped up to the small podium. She looked elegant, but simple, with no flashy jewelry, just a pin of the center's logo on her lapel. Asterisk 3 years ago, Clara began, I wouldn't have walked into a place like this, not because I didn't believe in community, but because I didn't understand it. I thought success came from climbing alone. But it turns out, strength is found in service, in humility, in legacy. She glanced at Margaret then. My mother built her life in silence, in sacrifice, and when the world dismissed her, she didn't argue, she waited, she grew, and when she found her voice, she used it to build this. Asterisk there was no applause, yet, just silence, the good kind. Asterisk I used to think wealth was what you wore or owned. Now, I know better. Wealth is kindness passed forward. Its stories shared, its chairs pulled out for strangers, and its foundations like this where people can walk in broken and leave stronger. She paused, her voice softening. Mom, I hope this place reflects your strength and your story, because you taught me that true power doesn't need to scream. It just needs to keep going. Now the applause came. Margaret didn't cry. She didn't need to. Her hands folded quietly in her lap, and she nodded once, acknowledging the words, the moment, and the journey it took to get there. Asterisk later, as guests mingled and explored the center, Margaret walked to the dedication wall. Her name was etched there in bronze beneath a simple line, asterisk, in honor of the woman who proved quiet lives can leave loud legacies. Asterisk, she stood there for a long time, running her fingers over the letters, not with pride, but with peace. Asterisk behind her, Clara appeared. Do you like it? Asterisk Margaret turned. I do. But what I like more is seeing you here, becoming who you were, always meant to be. Asterisk, Clara exhaled. I was so lost. Asterisk, you were never lost, Margaret said. You were just looking in the wrong direction. Asterisk, they smiled at each other, and though so much had been broken between them in the past, something whole had begun to grow in its place, not perfect, not polished, but real. Asterisk outside, the sun began to set, but inside, something new had dawned. Asterisk, would you like chapter 7 next? Written in the same detailed and emotional style. Margaret never thought peace could feel so unfamiliar. Not unwelcome, just unfamiliar, like moving into a house where the walls echo differently than you're used to. For decades, her life had been structured around survival, sacrifice, and silence. Now, with the community center thriving and Clara stepping into her own with grace and conviction, the old battles had quieted. Margaret wasn't waiting for the next storm anymore. Instead, she found herself facing stillness and realizing that learning how to live in it was its own kind of work. Asterisk, she took up walking every morning early, before the city yawned awake. Her favorite route led through a winding park near the river, where cherry blossoms bloomed in soft defiance against the gray city skyline. She often brought breadcrumbs for the birds and sat on a particular bench for 30 minutes. Watching light touch the water like a secret. It was here, she reflected, whispered to Walter in her thoughts, and wrote in her notebook lines of poetry, plans for the foundation, names of people she wanted to remember. Asterisk one such morning, as she zipped her coat and reached her bench, she found someone already sitting there. Clara. She was in sneakers and leggings, a travel mug in hand, and a surprised smile spreading across her face. Asterisk, didn't expect to see you here this early, she said. Asterisk, Margaret smiled. This has been my spot for years. You're the one intruding. Asterisk, Clara scooted over. Then, let me make it up to you. I brought tea, mint, and honey. Asterisk, they sat quietly for a while, not needing to speak, not rushing to fill the space. It was a comfortable silence, the kind only possible between people who had walked through fire and survived. Asterisk eventually, Clara turned toward her. Do you ever feel like now that the chaos is gone, you don't quite know what to do with yourself? Asterisk Margaret nodded. Every day. Peace isn't as passive as people think. It takes effort to let it stay. Asterisk Clara sipped her tea. I've been thinking about something, and I need to tell you before I lose the nerve. Margaret raised an eyebrow but said nothing. I want to write about you, Clara said. I've started drafting something, a memoir, not just about my fall and learning, but about your story, your strength, everything you built in silence. Asterisk Margaret tilted her head slightly. Why now? Asterisk, because I see it all differently, Clara said, and maybe someone like me, who used to think you weren't enough, is the exact voice needed to prove how wrong that idea is. Maybe people need to hear about women like you, from people like me. Asterisk Margaret took a long breath. You think the world will listen? Asterisk Clara nodded. I think they'll listen because I was the kind of person who ignored you for years. And if I can change, maybe others will too. Asterisk Margaret stared out at the river, the water catching streaks of sunlight. You know, when I was young, I used to dream about being known, not famous, but seen, noticed. I wanted people to understand that a quiet life wasn't a wasted one. But when I married your father and became a mother, that dream shifted. I poured everything into love instead of legacy. Asterisk Clara placed her hand on her mother's. Maybe you can have both now. Asterisk Margaret smiled, a small, bittersweet curve of her lips. Maybe. Asterisk the next few weeks brought a new rhythm to their lives. Clara wrote each evening, usually sitting at the same dining table she once rolled her eyes at. She interviewed Margaret over cups of tea, long walks, and even during errands. They laughed more, now real belly-deep laughs. And they disagreed too, but it no longer felt like war. It felt like growth. Asterisk one day, after a particularly emotional session recalling Margaret's early years, her marriage to Walter, the loss of her job when Clara was just 7, the nights she pawned her jewelry to pay for school supplies, Clara sat in silence, tears welling in her eyes. I had no idea, she whispered. You weren't supposed to, Margaret replied, gently. I did my job. Asterisk Clara shook her head. No, you did so much more than a job. You gave me everything, and I treated it like nothing. Asterisk Margaret squeezed her hand. But you're seeing it now. That's enough. Asterisk they worked side by side at the foundation during the day, and wrote side by side at night. As the manuscript took shape, Clara pitched the concept to a small publisher she had once collaborated with during her more glamorous career days. To her surprise and nervous excitement, they loved the angle. Asterisk the working title was The Woman Who Waited, A Daughter's Story. Asterisk word spread slowly but surely. By the time the publisher announced the upcoming release, the buzz had grown beyond their circle. Local news outlets requested interviews. One small TV station aired a feature on Margaret's work and her transformation from forgotten mother to philanthropist icon. Asterisk then, one morning, Margaret received a call she never expected. Forbes, the voice said. She was seated in the center's lounge, knitting scarves for winter care packages. She nearly dropped her needles. Asterisk, yes, she said cautiously. Asterisk, we're preparing a national feature called Hidden Power, The Women You Overlook, and your name has come up from multiple nominations. Asterisk Margaret chuckled softly. So now the world's catching up. Asterisk the journalist laughed along. It seems so, but truly, Miss Ellison, your story, it's the kind that transcends headlines. We'd like to interview you. In person. Margaret agreed, but on one condition, Clara would be part of the story. The day of the interview arrived. A small team of professionals arrived at Margaret's apartment: stylists, photographers, and journalists. She kept things simple, a navy sweater, pearl earrings, and her old wedding ring. The feature was published 2 weeks later. The title, Asterisk from Mocked to Monumental, Margaret Ellison's Quiet Empire. Asterisk it included photos of the community center, excerpts from Clara's memoir, testimonials from women who had been helped by the foundation, and reflections from Margaret herself. But it was the last paragraph that struck Clara most. Asterisk, it's easy to ignore people who don't make noise. Margaret Ellison never screamed, never chased fame, never begged for recognition, and yet, her life became the echo that changed others. She didn't rise from nothing, she rose while carrying others. And now, the world is watching, not out of pity, but out of reverence. Asterisk when the magazine hit the stands, Margaret's photo soft, proud yet modest, stared back at shoppers from airport kiosks, coffee tables, and waiting rooms. Clara saw it by accident at a bookstore and stood frozen for a moment. The cashier asked if she needed help. Asterisk no, she said softly. She already helped me more than she ever knew. Asterisk that evening, Margaret came home to a knock at her door. Clara stood there, holding a framed copy of the magazine. Asterisk, I want this in your office, she said. Asterisk, Margaret took it, smiling, only if yours hangs beside it. Asterisk, Clara looked at her for a long moment. Do you remember the day I told you you were nothing? That you had nothing. Asterisk Margaret nodded slowly. I remember. Asterisk Clara's voice broke. You were already a giant. I was just too small to see it. Asterisk Margaret pulled her into a hug. The kind she used to give when Clara skinned her knees or had nightmares. The kind that forgave without speaking. Asterisk, and just like that, the weight of decades lifted. Asterisk that night, as Margaret sat by her window, the framed magazine beside her, and the city quiet in its hush of lights, she allowed herself to believe something she had never dared before. She had won, not in the way her daughter once defined victory, not in luxury or applause, but in redemption, in legacy, in love that returned, not because it was owed, but because it was earned. Asterisk, she didn't need to be rich anymore. She didn't need to be right. Asterisk, she just needed to be remembered as she truly was. Asterisk, would you like chapter 8 next? In the same voice and detail. Clara never expected her book to matter as much as it did. When she had first sat down to write it, she thought of it as an apology in prose, a way to make amends through something lasting, something visible. She never imagined it would ripple out into something greater, into rooms she had never stepped into the hearts of strangers she had never met. Asterisk, but the woman who waited didn't just sell, it resonated. Asterisk, within weeks of its release, it climbed bestseller lists not because of hype, but because readers, especially women, found themselves within its pages. Book clubs across the country began reading it aloud, pausing between chapters, to wipe tears and share their own stories of underestimated mothers and unheard women. Letters poured into the foundation, some handwritten, some typed, many emailed. They were confessions of regret, declarations of admiration, and thank yous from daughters who promised to call their mothers more often. Asterisk Clara was stunned, not by the numbers, but by the honesty. I thought people would see it as a personal story, she told Margaret one morning as they walked through the community center's new wing, but I didn't know they'd see themselves in it. Asterisk Margaret, who had always known her story was not unique, only smiled. The truth is, the quiet ones are everywhere. The world's just learning how to listen. Asterisk, and the world truly was listening now. Asterisk Margaret received invitations, daily television interviews, panel discussions, awards. She declined most of them, uncomfortable with the stage. Her comfort was in presence, not performance, but there were some offers she couldn't ignore. Asterisk 1 was a keynote request from the National Women's Leadership Summit. When she first read the letter, she almost laughed. I'm not a speaker, she told Clara. I'm a knitter who happened to outlive the world's doubt. Asterisk, but Clara gently encouraged her. You don't have to speak like a politician. Just speak like you always have, with truth. So Margaret accepted. The event was held in a grand hotel ballroom, all polished marble floors and chandeliers. When she stepped onto the stage, escorted by a young volunteer who looked at her like she was royalty, the crowd of nearly 1,000 women rose to their feet, not for her wealth, not for her fame, but for her journey. Asterisk Margaret stood behind the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. For a moment, she said nothing. She simply breathed. Then she began. I was never supposed to be here, she said. I wasn't groomed for greatness. I didn't study leadership or wear power suits. I didn't make headlines. I made meals. I made peace. I made do. A few quiet chuckles rippled through the crowd. I raised a daughter in a one-bedroom apartment, and I watched her grow into a woman who forgot how she got there. I spent years being ignored, not just by society, but by the very person I gave everything to. And then, one day, she looked at me and asked, why didn't you do more with your life? The room fell silent. I didn't answer her then, because I wasn't angry. I was disappointed in her, yes, but also in myself, for allowing the world to convince me that survival was small. She paused, her eyes sweeping across the audience. I had let the world tell me that motherhood wasn't legacy, that sacrifice wasn't ambition, that kindness wasn't a strategy. But I know better now, and so does my daughter. Asterisk, Margaret's voice didn't tremble. It rose slowly, softly, but with certainty. Asterisk, if you are raising someone, building something, surviving loss, feeding hope, don't let them tell you it's not power. It is, and it's the kind of power they'll only recognize when it's too late to ignore. Asterisk, the crowd stood again. Applause thundered. Asterisk, after the summit, the story made national news again. Margaret Ellison, once a forgotten widow in a small apartment, was now being called America's grandmother. People who had never heard of her 3 months ago now quoted her in social media captions. A senator referenced her in a speech. A popular podcast dedicated an entire episode to her foundation's model, calling it a blueprint for sustainable compassion. But through it all, Margaret remained unchanged. She still lived in her old apartment, though she now had the option to buy a penthouse if she wished. She still shopped at the same market, still waved to the same crossing guard each morning, still donated her time to the community center's knitting circle every Thursday. What changed was not her essence, the way the world finally looked at it. Clara, too, found a deeper rhythm in her life. The more she led the community center, the more she found herself fulfilled, not by recognition, but by connection. She became protective of her staff, deeply involved in every program. She personally mentored 2 teen interns from underprivileged backgrounds, both of whom later earned scholarships through the foundation. She started dating anxiously, slowly, and told Margaret about it over tea, the way daughters are supposed to. One evening, as the air turned crisp with the promise of autumn, Margaret sat in the center's library reading a letter from a woman in Ohio. It read, "Greater than Dear Ms. Ellison, I'm 47 years old. My daughter hasn't spoken to me in 5 years. After reading about you, I decided to write her a letter, out of guilt, but out of love." She responded, "We're meeting next week, thank you. You didn't just change your story, you changed mine." Margaret folded the letter slowly and placed it in a special drawer at the reception desk labeled Echoes. Clara had come up with the name for the drawer, because what you've done, she had said, doesn't end with you, it echoes. That night, as they locked up the center and walked out together, Clara turned to her mother, under the amber glow of ASTREETLIGHT. "You know, I used to think your power came from the money you found," she said, "but it didn't. The money just uncovered it. You were always this strong. I was just too loud to hear it." Margaret smiled. "Sometimes we don't recognize the light in others until we run out of our own." Clara slipped her arm through her mother's. "You've made me believe in redemption." "And you," Margaret said softly, "have made me believe in forgiveness." They walked home like that 2 women who had once stood on opposite sides of disappointment, now moving forward in rhythm. The past hadn't vanished, but it no longer held them hostage. And then came the final surprise, a call from a representative of the Global Women's Alliance. They wanted to award Margaret with the Life Achievement Honor for Grassroots Legacy, a ceremony in Paris, an international audience. Margaret's first instinct was to decline. "I've never even left the country," she said. "But you've touched it," Clara replied. "It's time you saw it. Love you back." In the weeks leading up to the trip, they applied for passports, chose dresses, and readied speeches. Margaret even agreed to try French pastries in advance, to Clara's delight. When the plane finally lifted off the tarmac, Margaret looked out the window and whispered to herself, "Walter, we're flying." Paris was everything she imagined, romantic, historic, alive. But what struck her most wasn't the Eiffel Tower or the Louvre. It was the women, dozens of them from countries she'd never heard of, coming up to her after the event, thanking her in broken English or tearful gestures for reminding them that their silent stories mattered. As she stood on that international stage, accepting her award, she didn't boast. She didn't cry. She simply said, "The loudest stories are not always the ones told through microphones. Sometimes, the loudest stories are lived quietly for decades before anyone decides to listen." It wasn't applause that followed, it was a standing ovation. Would you like the final chapter 9 now? In the same heartfelt and cinematic style, Margaret sat by the large window of her Paris hotel room, a warm breeze stirring the curtains like a whisper from the past. It had been an overwhelming 3 days Anne International Award, interviews translated into multiple languages, strangers embracing her like family. But now, as the sun dipped behind the golden rooftops and the Eiffel Tower glittered in the distance, she felt something else settle into her chest. Stillness, not emptiness, not fatigue, just stillness, like the exhale that comes after a long, hard climb. Clara sat nearby, curled up on a velvet chair, with her feet tucked beneath her. She was reading the latest round of letters from readers of the memoir. One was from a woman in Turkey who had started a school in her mother's honor. Another, from a teenager in Brazil, who said Margaret's story had given her the courage to pursue education instead of an arranged marriage. Clara had stopped reading aloud a while ago, Too choked up to continue. You know, Clara said, looking over the top of the letter, if I had been told a year ago that I'd be in Paris with my mother who's being honored globally, would have laughed and probably bought another handbag to fill the silence. Margaret chuckled softly. You always did try to shop your way around emotions. Because I didn't understand them, Clara said. But now I see. Emotions aren't things to be avoided. They're things to walk through. Margaret took a long sip of her tea and looked out at the horizon. You've changed. Clara smiled. I've changed because I finally listened to someone worth listening to. The next morning, they flew home, greeted by volunteers from the foundation, who welcomed them like returning champions. The community center was decorated with streamers and banners. Welcome back, Margaret, our light, our leader, from Paris to home. Margaret was moved, but insisted on something simpler. Community dinner in the center's courtyard. No speeches, no cameras, just food and stories and laughter. That evening, the courtyard sparkled with string lights, tables filled with potluck dishes, and the kind of joy that doesn't need music to be felt. She sat at the center table, surrounded by faces she'd come to know and love. Women who once walked and broken now led support groups. Young men who once feared their voices now taught reading classes. And Clara, smiling, organizing, nurturing fully at home, in her calling. Halfway through the evening, a little girl with thick glasses and a sunflower dress walked up to Margaret holding a folded piece of paper. My mommy says you made this place, she said shyly. Margaret smiled. I had help. The girl nodded solemnly and handed her the note before skipping away. Margaret unfolded it. Inside was a crayon drawing of a large heart with two small figures, one tall, one shorter, holding hands. At the bottom, it read, Miss Margaret and the World. Her eyes misted. She folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her coat pocket. As night deepened, she stood from her chair and looked around. No microphone, no announcement, just presence, just memory. She caught Clara's eye across the table, and for a moment, they didn't need words. Later that week, back at her apartment, Margaret made a quiet decision. She called Daniel, her financial advisor, and Judith, her lawyer. I'd like to set my affairs in order, she said, while I'm still clear of mind. They met in her living room. There was no urgency, no illness, just intention. She left the bulk of her estate to the foundation, ensuring its longevity. A generous but reasonable sum was left to Clara, not as an inheritance, but as a gesture. She no longer needs rescuing, Margaret said, but I want her to have the freedom to keep building. She also wrote a letter to be opened only after her death. It wasn't sad or dramatic, just reflective. She included advice, laughter, forgiveness. A month later, Margaret took a walk by the river alone. The cherry blossoms had returned, pale pink against the pale blue sky. She sat on her usual bench and pulled out a small notebook. She wrote, I have lived a life many would have skipped past. I was underestimated, overlooked, and, for a long time, unseen. But I was never unworthy. I carried light, even when no one looked. And in the end, I didn't rise by force. I rose by waiting. With love, with dignity, with truth. She closed the book, smiled at the birds, and walked home slowly. That night, she cooked her favorite meal, lemon thyme chicken, roasted potatoes, and a small slice of carrot cake. She listened to old records, let the windows stay open, and laughed to herself when the wind knocked over a flower vase. She went to bed early, and she didn't wake up. It was peaceful, as if her body knew the story had ended exactly where it should. When Clara found her the next morning, it felt like time had cracked open. She sat by her mother's bed, holding her hand long after it had gone cold. There were no screams, no sobbing, just reverence. She found the notebook, the letters, the documents, all perfectly organized. Margaret had prepared for this with the same grace she had lived with. The funeral was held in the courtyard of the center. Hundreds came, volunteers, neighbors, women from shelters, children, city officials, even strangers who had only known her through stories. They held candles, they shared memories. One by one, they spoke. She helped me believe again. She fed me when I hadn't eaten in days. She looked me in the eye when no one else would. Asterisk Clara stood last. She wore no black only, a soft lavender coat, the same color Margaret once said reminded her of spring. Asterisk My mother died the way she lived quietly, with grace, she said, but her impact was thunder. She taught me that true power isn't in money or recognition. It's in showing up, in listening, in doing the small things that change everything. She paused, holding up a small frame. This was the last thing she kept in her pocket. A note from a little girl. She read it aloud. Miss Margaret and the world. The crowd stood together in silence, not mourning a loss, but honoring a presence. Asterisk In the months that followed, the center expanded. A new scholarship was introduced, the Margaret Ellison Quiet Power Grant, for women over 50 starting their first nonprofit or community project. It funded dozens of ventures in its first year alone. Asterisk The memoir was re-released with a new epilogue written by Clara, recounting her mother's final days and the lessons still blooming from her life. Asterisk People continued to visit the dedication wall at the center. Beneath her name, Clara added a new line. Asterisk She didn't just rise. She raised us all. Asterisk Clara continued directing the center, now with more fire than ever. But on Thursday afternoons, she took a break. She sat in the knitting circle her mother started, holding yarn that Margaret once touched, listening to laughter echo through the hall like soft applause. Asterisk And sometimes, when the day was quiet and the light hit the window just right, she could almost hear her mother's voice in the breeze. Asterisk You were never too late. You were just on time. Asterisk The world remembered Margaret Ellison not as a millionaire, or a mogul, or even a martyr. They remembered her as the woman who waited, and changed everything while doing so. Asterisk The end. Asterisk Would you like help designing a cover page, YouTube thumbnail, or turning this into a short film script or audiobook version?